Sorry.
Happy to have that, and the more it can reach, the better.
Okay, so welcome to the History for Lunch for March. We are in our third month of 2021. It's hard to believe that we are already in the month of March, and I think everybody's ready for warmer weather and sunny days. But we're delighted that everyone has joined us today for our History for Lunch. We have Dr. Bowman from Elizabeth City State University. I've known Dr. Bowman for several years now, not just on a professional level, but Dr. Bowman was one of my professors at Elizabeth City State University. So I think we go back to the early 2000s, and it's just nice to be able to continue to have the connection with Elizabeth City State and with the professors that I had, because I highly recommend the history department at Elizabeth City State University. So Dr. Bowman, I am going to go ahead and turn it over to you today.
All right. Thank you, Lori. And I thank you for those of you who are here this afternoon for lunch. Thank you for being here. Again, I always love sharing some of the local history, the deep, rich local history that exists and that is a part of Northeastern North Carolina. I prefer to do it, of course, in front of people and smiling faces, and hopefully we will get to that point again sometime later this year, perhaps. But today we have it on Zoom, and what we're doing today is actually, it's called A Story of Community, Ingenuity, and Luck. And it's a history, an early part of the history of what we call now the Elizabeth City State University, one of the constituent institutions in the University of North Carolina. And this institution has existed since 1891. And during its history, it has gone through several crises. Sometimes these crises have threatened its very existence. Some of these crises are more recent, stemming back to 2010. Some of them extend well back into the 19th century. That's kind of the focus today, is on a specific crisis that took place between around 1898 and 1905. Hold on here. Lori, I'm not able to, hold on here. Here you go. Okay, great. I'd like to start with a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who said that progress is neither automatic nor inevitable. Every step towards the goal of justice requires sacrifice, suffering, and struggle, the tireless exertions and passionate concern of dedicated individuals. In many ways, that's kind of the story of today. Back around this time of this crisis, in the early part of the 20th century, the Wright brothers were making fame and establishing the aviation industry, which is, as we all know, kind of booming here in this region. But meanwhile, while that was going on at Kitty Hawk, there was a crisis going on campus. Back then, it was called the Elizabeth City State Colored Normal School. And it was enduring, as the Wright brothers were making history, really sacrifice, suffering, and struggle. And again, it hadn't always been that way. When the school was established as a result of a successful bill that was written by Hugh Cale, who was an African-American legislator who served 5 terms in the North Carolina General Assembly. And in March 1891, his bill was successfully approved and it was signed into law. And the first classes began in early January 1892. And the early years were just years of excitement, promise, and progress. In 1896, it had 7 graduates, which might seem kind of small, but in those days, it was kind of big because we had 7 more than normal schools at Winston, Fayetteville, and Plymouth combined. And I'd like to point out is that from its early history, this institution has received community support. Even though it wasn't as a state-supported institution, private funds have kept this institution afloat. And note that the early records show that area African-American churches were especially active in supporting this institution. But the bottom line was, for the first 20 or so years of its existence, this institution existed in rented buildings. It did not exist where it does now. And this is an example of really the second building that we were in between 1893 and 1912. This building actually still exists. It looks very different today. This used to be an Elks building on Harrington Road, and it's still there. It just looks very different from it did back in the day. The late 1890s things radically changed in North Carolina. There was a rise of a movement, and the movement was literally called white supremacy. Sometimes you see this phrase used today. You might hear it on television or read about it in the newspaper, but this was exactly what it was called back in the 1890s. Okay, this was a movement that could be described as white supremacy. This really was referred to as a white supremacy campaign. North Carolina had white supremacy clubs, which they promoted ideas and which they met locally and such, and that was a very different time. And a lot of this comes to the fact is that this was about politics. The Democratic Party in 1898 was out of power. There was a group of, let's say this way, a hodgepodge of political groups, Republicans, populists together, and they were regarded as fusionists, and they were in power. The fusionists in 1896 controlled the governor's mansion and both houses in the General Assembly. The Democrats wanted to get back in power, so they decided the way they were going to do that was to help break up this coalition. And so they said they're going to focus on the most vulnerable aspect of that coalition, and that was the African American group that was dominant in the Republican Party. So this was a specific effort, and this included the rise of a group of, let me put it this way, voter intimidation specialists called the Red Shirts. The Red Shirts had their origins in South Carolina, and they would actually go and intimidate voters, and they did so in the 1898 election. Sometimes they were carrying guns, and they would make it clear that if you voted, they might know who you are and might later on come after you. That kind of voter intimidation made it possible for the Democratic Party to win. The only place it really did not win during the 1898 election was actually in Wilmington, North Carolina. And Wilmington, North Carolina was the unfortunate site of a coup d'etat that effectively removed the duly elected government. Hugh Cale lost in 1898. The only surviving African American congressman was George Henry White, and he would continue to represent North Carolina's African Americans and the district for the next 2 years. Summer 1900, there was an effort to disfranchise African Americans, and they said that they needed to do this because they wanted to remove those who were quote unquote illiterate from the voting registers, and so they panicked people, and people voted to disfranchise fellow North Carolinians. And this was a referendum that was really replete with fraud. In one ward, less than half of Black votes were even counted. Sometimes the boards took 10 minutes to challenge each voter, so that would slow down the polls. People would get angry, frustrated, and just go home. In another ward, only one Republican ballot made it to the box before the polls closed. So this was a electoral fraud that was blatant, and the Disfranchisement Amendment to the Constitution passed. Now, what it meant was that, and again, this is complicated. It meant that illiterates would be allowed to vote, white illiterates or any illiterates, as long as their ancestors had been registered before 1867, and as long as they registered before 1908. But this meant that no whites could be disfranchised because ancestors had registered before that time, and no Black could be grandfathered in because Blacks could not even vote until 1867. So this was a specific effort to disfranchise African American voters, and by 1902, more than 9/10 of them had been purged from the voter registers. And I mean, the numbers were astounding. You look at like 98% of voters in North Carolina were white. And that of course, did not model the population by any means. But what did it do to schools like Elizabeth City State Normal School? what incentive would the General Assembly have to help this school if the voters were not made up of African Americans? Well, the answer would be obvious. There would be very little incentive. In 1900, Governor Charles B. Aycock was elected, and his promise was to have universal education. That was his campaign message. There was no true public school system in North Carolina at that time. So he got into office under that promise of universal education. And he said universal education for all, but that did not mean necessarily equal. It did not necessarily mean uh, equal opportunities. What happened over the next couple of years was that money was actually taken out of the pot that would used to help black schools and was given instead to white schools. And the point was that whites were grandfathered in only if they could pass literacy tests by 1908. Okay. So the goal then was to put more money to white schools so children could become voters who would pass the literacy tests. And that meant that their education was focused more on academics. Meanwhile, education for African Americans was focused not as much on academics, but on what they called industrial education. And that's a complicated subject. I could spend all day talking about it, but suffice it to say is that industrial education was not going to provide opportunities and would not provide the skills needed to succeed in the jobs that we expect to be able to succeed in today. This was simply blatantly unequal education, and it wasn't universal by any means. Okay, so what happened is, and this is true, but the state took over existing white normal schools in Boone, and which we call Appalachian State University today, and in the western part, it took over a school that is now called Western Carolina University, and a couple years later opened up another in Pitt County, and all of us know which school was that. That was what the school we call now East Carolina University, or I guess they prefer to be called ECU. But that was intentional. The goal was to have these tests pass, to have students be able to pass these tests. In 1901, the North Carolina General Assembly gave the State Board of Education the authority to close down black normal schools as it saw fit. And so that meant that as white schools were going to be expanded, that meant that black schools, such as the one in Elizabeth City, were now threatened with extinction. And sometimes the plea was consolidation. In other words, at this time there were seven normal schools for African Americans, and so the goal was to close down some under the euphemistic consolidation. And so that was the plan. The plan was the state was going to close down some of these schools. And that meant that Elizabeth City State Colored Normal School was one of those that could well be closed down. Okay, but it was going to happen. There was a shift now towards providing more of an academic education for whites. African Americans were no longer voting for the most part, so their needs could be safely neglected. Sad, but true. So this consolidation movement really led to a crisis on this institution. Of course, what did P.W. Moore, whom we might recognize as principal, the first chief executive of this institution, and the board? Here's a picture of P.W. Moore and the board. P.W. Moore is actually off to the right. This is actually a building on campus back around 1916. But what could they do? Because they knew this was coming. They knew they had to do something, or else they would lose the school. Well, they decided they were going to petition their General Assembly representative for support and asked for positive publicity in the newspapers. Of course, that's still done today, those kind of things. The board authorized a few members of the board, including S.L. Sheep, whom we might recognize that name as the name on the elementary school right near downtown, and also asked another board member, Enoch Farabee Lamb, to attend State Board of Education meetings in Raleigh to kind of promote the school's interest, to save it from being closed. Some of you might recognize this name, Mac Sawyer, M.N. Sawyer, Mac Sawyer, during a city, today we call it city council, but it was called the City Board of Aldermen. And during this meeting, Sawyer offered a resolution to try to retain the school at this place. So there was an effort by prominent whites to keep the school afloat. Now, you might say, why did they do this? Because if whites supported white supremacy, why would they be supporting Elizabeth City State Color Normal School? And again, this is a complicated subject, and I can only give it a brief attention here, but there were financial motives, okay, because local areas liked having state appropriations, just like the state appropriations that come to this area because of ECSU's existence. And what happened was, the thought was that if the state supports this normal school, then there would be a less of a need to have taxes go towards those schools. And that meant that a lot of African American students, children, got their education here on this campus, even though that's not what the school was meant for. Okay. There also were moral incentives. Many whites believed that these normal schools provided a moral education. And many said that slavery provided that moral education, and African Americans needed to have that kind of control so they would be morally upright citizens. And again, the assumption here is that education is partly meant to control people. And you do see that. There also were paternalistic motivations. The white man's burden, the poem, the famous poem that was written in the wake of the United States imperial efforts overseas, was in the air. And many whites believed that they had an obligation to help out their African American brethren. And again, they just thought that was an obligation. African Americans would have liked to have been able to fight for themselves and fight their own battles themselves, but they weren't able to do so, at least to a large degree, because of disfranchisement. Also, were educational motives. As we all know, literacy is expensive. And the fact is that the supporters of this normal school, many ways, were more progressive than many in Raleigh. Many whites saw educating blacks as actually making crime worse, which to us sounds ludicrous, and it is, but that was just an attitude that one saw and heard back in the early 1900s. So there were many motivations here. Principal Moore decided that he was going to work the state superintendent, a man named James Y. Joyner. Anybody who's been to the campus of East Carolina knows that's the Joyner Library. That was named after James Yatkin Joyner. Joyner was a white supremacist, like generally everybody was at that time. If you were white living in North Carolina, it's just the way things were. And Joyner wanted these normal schools to support industrial education, not academics. That meant drop Latin, drop any kind of classical training, but focus on teaching African American skills so they could actually be good farmers and be good household servants and such. Very different view of education than we would expect to be told today. There also were petitions. One was signed by summer school teachers at the normal school. This is an example of how African Americans did their part to save the school. They might not have been able to vote at the polls, and these were mostly women, and they certainly couldn't vote at the polls. But this was an effort, an example of how African Americans did not simply just let this happen. They tried to sign in the petition, can be found in the state archives of North Carolina, including another petition by this area's most prominent white men, including a former congressman. Okay. The point here is that there were seven normal schools at this point for African Americans. Elizabeth City was recognized for actually having a very competent board, a board whose interests were supportive of the school, not a board that was marked with apathy and disinterest. And so that actually gave this institution an advantage. That's a major positive. P.W. Moore actually told Superintendent Joyner that he had given it his all. And so if the school closed, it wasn't because he didn't do his best. He had been faithful. He had been earnest. He had done his job. He had done his job for God and for his students and for the community. But it was decided by 1903 that there would be fewer normal schools for African Americans. They were going to reduce the number from 7 to 4. So that meant that three were definitely going to close. Now, which 3 were going to be the ones sacrificed? Would the efforts at this school, at Elizabeth City State Color Normal School, be enough to save the school from extinction? Well, in July 1903, there was a State Board of Education meeting. And one person at the meeting, after deliberations, had made a motion that the surviving schools be those at Winston, Salisbury, Fayetteville, and Franklinton, and that the other three, including the one in Elizabeth City, be closed. Now, that's a motion on the floor. And again, if anybody's been to a meeting that includes Robert's Rules of Order, knows sometimes that when people make motions, sometimes it's almost ready to be voted on. I mean, how many times have you been to a meeting in which there was a motion and people said, no, we're not going to vote on it yet. We need to have, or someone actually says, no, this motion is not going to happen. Most times when you hear a motion, it's about ready to be passed. Luckily, one person at this meeting spoke up. It was not S.L. Sheep, who was also not just a state board of education member, but also on the state normal school board. But no, it was actually Secretary of State Brian Grimes. And he moved to change that motion. We recommended that the name Elizabeth City be crossed out, and instead Salisbury be put on the list of those to be closed. So that meant that Salisbury was going to be on the list, and of those schools that wasn't going to survive. And the motion this time carried, and the original motion was amended. Salisbury actually had a letter in support from a sitting U.S. Senator named Lee Overman. So Salisbury had strong support, but alas, it was to be closed. Salisbury Normal School was closed, its property sold, after expenses only $60 from the remains. Also closing was Plymouth State Normal School, whose equipment was moved to Elizabeth City. John Doles was actually an instructor at Plymouth, and he moved to Elizabeth City as well, and he became a very famous instructor, and actually a building was named after him. Unfortunately, the building was torn down a few months ago, but John Doles was one of those that was brought over from Plymouth. But this meant that for now, in 1903, this school was going to survive, which is a relief. What actually helped out this effort was in October that year, the school receives a major gift. It was 5 acres of land outside of town. Now, we call this area now part of Elizabeth City, but back then, this was not seen as the city proper. It was 5 acres right where the campus is now, and it was given by Ohio residents, Reverend William and Mary Yost of Cleveland, and their daughter-in-law Ella Post Pryor, and their son-in-law Robert Pryor. Robert Pryor was a teetotaler, very religious, and he did support African Americans. He believed that he had an obligation to help out his community. He built buildings for his lumber workers. These buildings became known as part of a place called Pryortown. Some of you who might be hearing this remember decades ago there was it used to be called Pryortown. Well, that was from Robert Pryor. Pryor and his spouse gave the school 5 acres. So that was great because that meant there was now a permanent piece of property that was now possessed by the school. But in 1903, this consolidation that closed down 3 schools, it wasn't over. And in 1904, things weren't getting any better. In fact, there were some in the General Assembly who wanted to divide the school funds by race, which would be completely unfair because, for the most part, African Americans were not free until really 4 decades before. So they didn't have the money, they didn't have the jobs, they didn't have the capital. Dividing school funds by race would have just crippled these schools. So the point here is closing down 3 schools did not satisfy those who wanted to close down more. And there was this effort. So that meant there was another consolidation crisis. In 1905, Superintendent Joyner, he actually supported the remaining schools. He did not want to close down any more schools. He supported an effort to gain an extra $5,000 for the 4 surviving Black normal schools to share. Now, $5,000 doesn't sound like very much, but back then, this was the difference between survival and extinction. The General Assembly said, no, we're not interested because we're doing other things. We're buying other normal schools and we need to build those up. Because by 1908, whites had to prove literacy at the polls or else they wouldn't be allowed to vote. they wouldn't be able to pass the literacy tests, presumably. So their interest was not supporting Black schools. So Joyner tried and just simply wouldn't listen to him. So that meant there was another crisis. Okay, so Joyner, desperate now because he couldn't get the funds these schools needed, he said, you know what, I don't want to do this, but we're going to have to close down 2 more schools. And a motion was made, again, because Joyner, as the state superintendent of public instruction, was a member of the State Board of Education. And so that meant that once again, Elizabeth City State Normal School was in jeopardy. Their survival, not certain. Now, there were Winston-Salem Industrial School and State Normal School already had permanent facilities. They already had their own land. They already had their own buildings. So it was clear that that school would not be closed, okay, because it already had permanent facilities. So that meant if that 2 were going to be closed, that meant 2 out of the 3, and that means the chances of the Elizabeth City were really in that way only 1 out of 3, because the assumption was that the school in Winston wasn't going to be closed because they already had permanent buildings and such. But like in 1903 at a State Board of Education meeting, a member recommended modifying the motion, and this was time State Auditor Dixon. He proposed keeping 3 schools and closing down only 1. And Governor Robert Glen, who had succeeded Aycock in the election in 1904, agreed, and the motion was carried by a close 3-2 margin. Okay, so there was definitely people who didn't agree with this. If it had been 2-3, one really has to wonder if this school would exist today. Well, what happened was now it was determined that 1 school was going to be closed. And that meant that the 4 remaining boards were told that on June 19th, the state board expected somebody from those schools to come to Raleigh and explain why their school should survive. And it was determined that the school who made the weakest case for their existence would be closed. Now, again, it could have been worse. It could have been 2 schools, but only this time 1 school would be closed. Now, the state wanted to see evidence of local financial support. And the question would be, would the land that the Pryors had given, those 5 acres, would that be enough to show community, local financial support? And by the way, what is even enough? Okay, who defines that term? I mean, that's an arbitrary term, especially when it comes to political decisions, as we all know. Enough? That's the question. And the board of managers in Elizabeth City agreed that they were going to show the state the deed to the 5 acres and would say, these are yours. Plus, there would be additional monies. And many of these monies had been pledges and money given by local citizens. And some of these people were so poor that they only were able to give like a dime. Now, we might say a dime is nothing, but back in those days, a dime could make a minor difference. A dime could buy a decent meal. So again, this might seem like not a lot of money, but this was a lot of money back in those days. And over time, this little tiny capital campaign grew to around $7,500 in cash and assets. So in addition, not just the 5 acres, but the board said that board member Lamb would give a deed to the state for the town lot and the building that the school was using that was worth $3,000. Now the question is, did the school own this land? Because remember I mentioned earlier on that this was rented facilities and that it wasn't until 1912 that the school existed where it does now. So then if they're offering this deed, whose land is it? Well, the reality is that this was the property that the Freedmen's School was built on in 1870. This land actually had been given to local African Americans by Judge George Brooks. And probably some of you might have seen the George Brooks house right across from CBS. George Brooks, complicated man. George Brooks was a supporter of the Union. George Brooks was also a slave owner. And George Brooks, after the war, was one of the few whites in town who were willing to sell land or give land to African Americans. The reality was that many whites who owned the land, who owned farmland, refused to sell it to a person of color. And Brooks had given this land, and the school was built on that land. And this school was actually had its own separate board of managers, its own board of trustees. Now, P.W. Moore was on this board. So he was on the board of the managers of the school building. Okay, so there's like the managers for the school building and then the managers for the school itself. So P.W. Moore was on this other board. And the school was renting it. You can't give up. I mean, if you're going to a bank and you want to get a loan and you offer collateral, you don't offer a house that you're renting. You're the renter. You don't own it. Well, the school was desperate because it didn't want to be closed down. So what happened is apparently the board told P.W. Moore to kind of get the property transferred from the building's trustees to the state. And P.W. Moore succeeded in doing this. And the transfer was signed in August 1905. Now, again, you know, this is the sign of just how desperate people were to do this. In June 1905, the state board met and determined which school would be abolished. And the Elizabeth City School offered the property, which, by the way, was not completely even settled yet, plus money and pledges. So about $7,800. Would it be enough? Well, the good news is that it was enough only because nobody from the Franklinton State Normal School bothered to show up. So I think that this shows you exactly what the community thought of this other school. Unlike Elizabeth City, and one can say that the State Normal School in Elizabeth City had board members who might not have always had the best interest of African Americans at heart, but at least they supported the school. At least they fought to keep it from being closed, and it was that effort that kept the school survive. So the idea was here is that Franklinton was going to be that one school to be closed because nobody cared enough from that town to show up at Raleigh to make the case for that school to survive. And so now we're down to 3. Okay, Elizabeth City survived by default, and 2 others. And I just wanted to ask you here, do you have any guess where these other 2 schools are located?
If you would like to place a guess in, you can do it in the Q&A if you would like to place a guess.
Give you a few moments here. Where were the other 2 schools that survived? Elizabeth City was one, as we all know, because we're still here. We're still standing. All right, I'm going to just give the answer here because I know lunch is only for some short time. Fayetteville and Winston-Salem. So Fayetteville State University and Winston-Salem State University were these other 2 schools, and obviously they survived, and they still survive to this day. And these are the 3 original state normal schools that existed. Now back to that property transfer. In 1912, State Normal School had finally its own buildings. They finally were able to move to campus. And so the state wanted to sell this 1870 Freedmen's Bureau school. And now the trustees who own this property were like, huh? This is ours. The state doesn't own this. And so what happened is these trustees were mad at P.W. Moore and claimed that he had told them false, deceitful, and fraudulent things to get them to sign the paperwork. And they actually sued, and a local jury in district court ruled in favor of the trustees. Like, oh my goodness. Well, the state appealed to the North Carolina Supreme Court, and in 1914, the verdict was overturned in the case C.W. Brown et al. Versus State Board of Education. So then if the state owned that land, the state could sell that land, and as you know, that is not been that is no longer a school. I guess it's kind of a timely lesson here about education and politics. They're kind of like the peanut butter and jelly of government. They kind of go together, because I think it's clear to see the politics and how politics shape education and how politics shape these series of crises that threaten the existence of the normal school between 1898 and 1905. And again, this is just an overview. So I'm actually working on an article for a book, and the article I need to get it done in the next 3 weeks. And I go over it in a lot more detail. This is also discussed briefly in the book that I wrote back in 2015. And this is the continuity of a historical legacy of excellence and resilience. And it's a history of ECSU. And the book is still, from my understanding, still available in the museum bookstore. So if you're interested in a copy, I know there are not many copies left, but if you're still interested in the copy, I think you might want to make a trip to the bookstore. just to see if they're still available. In any case, thank you very much for your attention. And any questions?
If you have a question for Dr. Bowman, if you will type it in the Q&A, and we're monitoring the Q&A right now. Let's see here. Dr. Reed has a question, so I'm going to allow Dr. Reed to ask his question. So, Dr. Reed, I'm allowing you to talk. Whoops.
Oh, sorry. I didn't mean to press the raise hand button. I'm sorry.
Okay, you're fine. I'm sorry. Okay, so I do have a question, Dr. Bowman.
Yes.
I'm sorry. I have no, this is from Miss Erling Sutton, and she states, I have no question. I just wanted to say thank you. This was a very good discussion. So much not known.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Ms. Sutton. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Actually, Mrs. Sutton is a volunteer here at the Museum of the Albemarle, and I believe she's a member of our Friends of the Museum of the Albemarle too. So, do we have any more questions? Because I can, and even if you have a question about, I know that Dr. Bowman, he has done quite a bit of research on, of course, he has his book, but he's wrote several articles for us here at the museum. And at one time, Dr. Bowman was submitting weekly, I believe it was weekly daily advance articles. And
Correct.
at one time. Okay, so Mr. Frank Johnson, he says, thank you for that information. And again, you're very popular today, Dr. Bowman. We have Miss Mary Dent. And thank you for the presentation. My daddy worked at the lumber mill and my mom attended state normal. So
oh, wow.
that is a quite a bit. And then so I have a Q&A and I have a chat is not, we'll figure the chat situation out. But do we have any more questions?
So I'm happy to entertain questions at my university email account, which is GCBOWMAN, so GC Bowman, lowercase letters, at ecsu.edu. I'm happy to entertain questions specifically. And again, as always, the story is more complicated than this. But again, this is a history for lunch. And it's not history for all day. But again, it's an interesting story that really hasn't been discussed. And I would say even the state crisis, the consolidation movement, hasn't really been given the proper attention yet. It's just remarkable to see just how dangerous things were in the state during the white supremacy campaign, and it's absolutely frightening, and it's shocking. I'm just saying. And again, sometimes if you have a newspapers.com account through Ancestry, you can see some of these newspapers and just read these articles and just be astounded what people were saying and what people were believing. And so again, if anything, it was worse than I had time to go over. I mean, I could share a lot more details that would break people's hearts, but again,
okay,
it is what it is.
And
thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bowman. If you did not catch Dr. Bowman's email address, you can always email your question to me here at the museum. And I think you might have received my email address when you registered for the event. And I will make sure that the email is forwarded to Dr. Bowman at Elizabeth City State University. Oh, so I do have a comment that has just popped up. Again, just a very informative information, and thank you very much. So,
thank you.
Well, again, I'm sorry, Dr. Bowman. So again, we would like to thank Dr. Bowman from Elizabeth City State University for joining us today. And if I'm correct, Dr. Bowman, we have you scheduled for the first Wednesday. I cannot remember, June or July.
I think it's July. I think this one was kind of a last minute. I think you had somebody else planned and it didn't work out, so I kind of agreed to fill in today. But the one in July is going to be on education, just a much later period of education.
Yes. So please watch for information coming out for our History for Lunch in July. Maybe by that point we can do a hybrid program where we can gather a small group based upon capacity in our auditorium, and we can still have individuals to join us from home. So we are trying here at the Museum of the Albemarle to go hybrid so that we can start gathering again in small groups as long as we maintain our 3 W's here at the Museum of the Albemarle. So Dr. Bowman, maybe we can go live and have people with us that day in July.
I hope so. I like seeing people. I enjoy that, and I like that personal contact. And I'm hoping we can do something like that, and hopefully everybody has getting their vaccines, and so we can actually be able to do that.
We are going to do our best to go hybrid as soon as we possibly can. So just remember that. But too, for our guests who are joining us from a distance that cannot make it to the museum, we are going to continue with the virtual programming just so that you can continue to be a part of our programming here at the museum, because we have seemed to reach a lot of people that would have to drive a distance to visit the museum. We want you to come and visit the Museum of the Albemarle, but we still want you to be able to join if you're not able to be in person. Again, Dr. Bowman, thank you very much. Thank you to all.
Thank you for providing me.
Yes, and thank you to all of our visitors that have logged on. Just remember, keep watching all of our social media, the newspaper, to see events that are coming up and to see when we can actually start gathering in small groups. And we hope it's in the near future rather than later down the road. Again, thank you to everyone today. Thank you, Dr. Bowman.
Thank you. Thank you, Lori.
Okay, you all have a great day, and we will see everyone for our History for Lunch that is scheduled for Wednesday, March the 17th. Thank you.
Thank you. All right.